The effect of the stock market crash had been disastrous. There was growing violence as an angry population took out their frustration on the corporations who were seen to have caused this disaster. Then, in 1932, a new president was elected who was also going to use the power of the state to control the free market. But his aim was not to destroy democracy, but to strengthen it. And to do this, he was going to develop a new way of dealing with the masses.
I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. But in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power.
It was the start of what would become known as the New Deal. Roosevelt assembled a group of young technocrats and planners in Washington. He told them that their job was to plan and run giant new industrial projects for the good of the nation. Roosevelt was convinced that the stock market crash had shown that laissez-faire capitalism could no longer run modern industrial economies. It had become the job of government. Big business was horrified, but the New Deal attracted the admiration of the Nazis, especially Joseph Goebbels.
Wir betrachten die wirtschaftliche Entwicklung in Amerika mit dem allergrößten positiven Interesse. Und wir sind dort der festen Überzeugung, dass Präsident Roosevelt und seine Berater auf dem richtigen Wege sind. Es handelt sich in der Tat um das größte wirtschaftliche und soziale Problem aller Zeiten. Die vielen Millionen Arbeitslosen, die ihre Plätze an den Maschinen und in den Kontoren verloren haben, wieder an ihre alten Arbeitsstellen zurückzuführen. Das kann nicht allein der privaten Initiative überlassen werden. Ausschlaggebend ist, dass die öffentliche Hand mit positiven Maßnahmen eingreift.
But although Roosevelt, like the Nazis, was trying to organize society in a different way, unlike the Nazis, he believed that human beings were rational and could be trusted to take an active part in government. Roosevelt believed it was possible to explain his policies to ordinary Americans and take into account their opinions. To do this, he was helped by the new ideas of an American social scientist called George Gallup.
Favorite reading of New Deal Washington, the survey of U.S. public opinion. From offices at Princeton, New Jersey, a famed statistician, Dr. George Gallup, tells Washington from week to week what the nation is thinking. And in New York, Fortune magazine's analyst, Elmo Roper, compiles for publication a continuous record of the nation's approval or disapproval of how the country is being run.
Gallup and Roper rejected Bernays' view that human beings were at the mercy of unconscious forces and so needed to be controlled. Their system of opinion polling was based on the idea that people could be trusted to know what they wanted. They argued that one could measure and predict the opinions and behaviour of the public if one asked strictly factual questions and avoided manipulating their emotions.
Well, how about this one? Do you think Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal has been bad for the nation in general?
No, that question's loaded. It automatically suggests an answer.
Well, how about this? Is your present feeling toward President Roosevelt one of general approval or general disapproval?
That's better.
Prior to scientific polling, the view of many people was that you couldn't trust public opinion. It was irrational, that it was ill-informed, it was chaotic, unruly, and so forth. And so that opinion should be dismissed. But with scientific polling, I think it established very clearly that people are rational, that they do make good decisions, and this offers democracy a chance to be truly informed by the public, giving everybody a voice in the way the country is run. I know my father wouldn't necessarily say the voice of the public is the voice of God, but he did feel very much that the voice of the people is a rational voice and should be heard.
What Roosevelt was doing was forging a new connection between the masses and politicians, No longer were they irrational consumers who were managed by sating their desires. Instead, they were sensible citizens who could take part in the governing of the country. In 1936, Roosevelt stood for re-election. He promised further control over big business. To the corporations, it was the beginning of a dictatorship.
Roosevelt interferes with private enterprise and is running the country into debt for generations to come. The way to get recovery is to let business alone.
But Roosevelt was triumphantly re-elected.
It looks, my friends, like a real landslide this time. So please let me thank you again and tell you that I hope to see you all very soon and bid you an affectionate good night.
Faced with this, business now decided to fight back, to regain power in America. At the heart of the battle would be Edward Bernays and the profession he had invented, public relations.
Following that election, business people start to get together and start to carry on discussions, primarily in private, and they start talking to each other about the need to sort of carry on ideological warfare against the New Deal and to sort of reassert the sort of connectedness between the idea of democracy on the one hand and the idea of privately owned business on the other. And so, under the umbrella of an organization which still exists, which is called the National Association of Manufacturers, and whose membership included all of the major corporations of the United States, a campaign is launched explicitly designed to create emotional attachments between the public and big business. It's Bernays' techniques being used on a grand scale. I mean, totally.
The General Motors Parade of Progress, traveling the high roads and byroads of America, bringing to millions of Americans in their own hometown the fascinating story behind modern industry, showing...
The campaign set out to show dramatically that it was business, not politicians, who had created modern America.
A better mode of living for all of us.
Bernays was an advisor to General Motors, but he was no longer alone. The industry he had founded now flourished as hundreds of public relations advisors organized a vast campaign. They not only used advertisements and billboards, but managed to insinuate their message into the editorial pages of the newspapers. It became a bitter fight. In response to the campaign, the government made films that warned of the unscrupulous manipulation of the press by big business. And the central villain was the new figure of the public relations man.
They tried to achieve their ends by working entirely behind the scenes, corrupting and deceiving the public. The aims of such groups may be either good or bad, so far as the public interest is concerned, but their methods are a grave danger to democratic institutions.
The films also showed how the responsible citizen could monitor the press themselves. They could create a chart that analyzed the reporting for signs of hidden bias. But such earnest instruction was to be no match for the powerful imagination of Edward Bernays.
Okay, Buongiorno here with you guys for one last lecture, one last go-round, one last time, due to the fact that I had made a promise that we were going to at least do some coverage on Chapter 12 of Berger's book on content analysis. And I decided to play a piece, a segment from the Adam Curtis documentary, The Century of the Self, which we are rounding out image theory with. It's a 4-part documentary series that we've been watching, and I've been doing some lectures on in image theory to kind of round that class out. But I was thinking about, how to do, I've been doing these little snippets, these kind of lead-ins into, because I got tired of dressing up, to be honest with you. I got tired with that whole rigmarole and, making it theatrical that way, and some of my decision-making processes around some of the characters I was going to portray were somewhat suspect and somewhat incendiary. So I just decided to start, putting little, to make it interesting, these lead-ins. But we've been doing Century of the Self in the other class. And I would strongly, I'm going to keep the blog up, and I know you guys got other things on your mind and with the summer coming and all that, but I would strongly suggest watching the entire documentary. And I would suggest looking at some of my lectures if some of you were taking that course, so you would have watched the lectures, but I brought in this segment due to the fact that, without giving it a lot of back history, there was this period, not unlike our own period of economic crisis with the Depression and Franklin Delano Roosevelt coming in to the presidency, with a conception of the American public being fairly rational. And there was this kind of struggle going on between the New Deal and a lot of Roosevelt's policies and what corporate America was trying to do to fight back and plant all kinds of totally biased stories in the press. And, hence, we see this series of strategies of trusting the rationality of the American public, and a couple of tools that Roosevelt would ultimately use would be the surveys, the idea of a survey, the opinion, that period really becomes the birth of scientific polling. Scientific polling meaning unbiased polling, which would exist, which has become extinct. In 2020, it's like, but there was this flickering, shining moment in human history in which the U.S. government really kind of took it upon themselves to keep the public educated, to keep the public aware of things, and to keep the public aware of the ways in which corporations were already kind of, and they always had. Anybody that has taken my course in Intro to Mass Media knows the ways in which the corporatocracy has always kind of controlled the mainstream media, but how that got worse and worse and worse. And but even in Roosevelt's time in the mid 40s, they literally put out informational newsreels to tell people how to do content analysis. Basically, that segment ends up with these instructional films being given to the American public to be able to do basically what constitutes content analysis. Hence the importance of why is so that one might pose the question: why is content analysis of newspapers and not just content analysis of newspapers and magazines, but content analysis of television shows and now it's like I think that we're going to see a future in media studies in which content analysis will still be a very, very viable methodology in media research. And we'll talk about its pluses, we'll talk about its downsides, we'll talk about what it is and what it isn't, and we'll talk about how it's going to continue to be important in the future, And I would narrow the focus down to the importance it is going to have in continuing to analyze not only children's programming, but the entire digital milieu, the entire digital infrastructure of content that is being beamed at children. And a lot of you guys know that I substitute teach, I deal with kids all the time, and was exposed to seeing some of the ways in which these paradigmatic shifts into raising our children via machine are going to be highly deleterious to the future, not to mention other things, but like the environment and the economy and all that, but how and the ways in which media is going to shape. I put a lot of import on stressing the ways in which, in all of my classes, this becomes a motif, and I believe rightly so, that media is going to shape the future, after everything is said and done. It's like, you take, for an example, the ways in which the pandemic is being given to us, it's always through the media, irregardless of what politicians have to do and say, irregardless of what the scientific community has to say. Ultimately, the last point of contact has to come with our interface of how the media is framing all those other things. Hence the need to become media literate, and content analysis will continue to be one of the weapons. I say that. I use the word weapon decidedly against misinformation. So we're going to talk about content analysis. I hope everybody's doing well. This is going to be the last lecture. I have a feeling that a lot of you will not take a look at it. However, I would strongly, within this whole setup, it's like I have been, and I know that a lot of students have had problems either watching the videos or commenting on the videos, and that there's a general sense of this kind of de-energizing going on a very global level, and I think that in a private email with one of you, I had been talking about needing to stay disciplined, needing to stay focused on the things that are important, and for me, it's about keeping my side of the street clean and continuing to live up to the expectations that the administration has on me, and my own personal integrity, and making sure that you have the information that you need. My initial goals for the class were shifted due to the pandemic. I think that when I do the class again, nothing ever comes out right the first time, but I think if I do the class again, it's going to be, arranged a little differently, but at the same time, I think that you've gotten, due to the ways in which we had to shift the whole pedagogical aspect of doing things on video, I think you guys get a really robust survey of the different ways one researches, the different levels on which we can pick apart media as an environment, the different methodologies involved, and I think you've gotten a very robust picture of all the different modes of interpretation that need to go into navigating through the media as a matter of necessity, as a matter of continuing to stay informed and being able to, and what is media literacy ultimately? Media literacy is just, it's like, excuse the euphemism, is like media literacy is getting to the point of just being able to have a good bullshit filter. I'm helping you to like build, a much more robust and discerning bullshit filter, if you will. And content analysis does that too. Content analysis. And it's a long chapter. So I don't know if we're going to be able to do as much as I want with it. I have a tendency to go on and on and on about certain aspects of it. But we're going to give it a good old college try in the time that, we have. And this will be... And, it's like this is going to be up by tomorrow. It's Monday now. It's going to be up by tomorrow. And we would have met anyway tomorrow if we had been in a brick and mortar setting. And we probably would have done presentations. Since we're not doing that, I figure it's like one more lecture. As soon as I get this up and get it encoding, I'm going to send out an email reminding you guys where the final project needs to be by midnight. When you watch this, it's going to be Tuesday, so I'm going to say by like midnight on Tuesday. And also, I told people to, use Wednesday if you felt like your game was a little weak and you needed to get in some last shots of extra credit to comment on your peers, work, due to the fact that in a brick and mortar setting, that's what we would have been doing. But, best laid plans of mice and men, often go awry. Some of you have gone MIA, and that's unfortunate. And I'll have to deal with that accordingly. But at the same time, it's like, I'm fairly forgiving, and whatnot. And I know that, to coin the cliche that's been kicked around now, it's like, we are undergoing strange and uncertain times. But when you really think about it, most of my life has been spent in what I would consider to be very, very strange and uncertain times to start with. It's like, Buongiorno, it's just kind of like, this is another, and, the more that, you kind of pick up on what I have to, the information I have to disseminate, it's like, one has to pose the question, how much have things qualitatively changed, with the corporatocracy and the dumbing down of humanity, and the dehumanizing and the psychic violence, and the 1%, it's just theater, folks. It's theater, and this too shall pass. It becomes a question of whether this too shall pass into, a society that doesn't want to go over a cliff, or a society that just was like, hey, let's just go over the cliff, and what role are we going to play? What role are you going to play? Content analysis is one of the most commonly used research methodologies among scholars dealing with media and communication. Berger says this is because it can measure human behavior. Assuming that verbal behavior is a form of human behavior, in contrast to opinion polls, which are also very, very important, and somebody's doing a project on surveys. In contrast to opinion polls, which measure what people say they did or will do, right? Hence, the whole idea of an opinion. We don't know. Surveys give us some general, prognosticative tool, that is fallible in a lot of ways, and there's a lot, but also with content analysis, we'll find that, content analysis has to do with content analysis, like every other aspect of research, often has to do with like the planning and the model of your research, and what it allows for, how it's defined, and like any other thing. And I think it was very instructive for us early in the semester to do an exercise in which we were looking at academic media research through the lens of the New York Times, to understand how research is always contestable depending on the robustness of the experiment, what it allows for, and what often things get published in peer-reviewed journals. Peer-reviewed journals are no guaranteed towards robustness and validity, if there's blind spots in the research. A lot of times, like peer-reviewed literature has its own, there are weak studies and there are strong studies, and it's all a question of, it's all kind of relative, in contrast to opinion polls, which measure what people say they did or will do, but do not show us what people have actually done. Content analysis deals with actual behavior. It deals with, for instance, in newspapers, it's like, if I'm looking at an issue of a newspaper in my hand on a given day, to this morning's newspaper, it's like, it's a fact that this has been printed, this has been said about such and such, that this deed has been done, not the content itself, but the fact that this is the way that it was reported on. We don't have to argue about. So this idea of actual behavior, the way that commercials actually appear, the ways that television programming actually appears, and the ways in which games actually operate, as opposed to what somebody might or might not do, and the same thing with interviews. Remember that in interviews also, it's like we're attempting to get to some semblance of the truth, taking into consideration that people don't always tell the truth, or people sometimes tell you what they want you to hear, or people want to kind of take you down a rabbit hole, so that all these different tools kind of work in an assemblage in which we get a reasonable. It's like I always say, it's like, what is a model? A model of reality. A model of reality, always by definition, my personal definition of what a model is a reasonable approximation of the way things seem to be happening. A reasonable approximation of the way things seem to be happening. Emphasis on reasonable and emphasis on seems. Is it the truth? Maybe not, but it becomes a question of a kind of socially generated form of knowledge, that, it's like, we can all kind of get on the same page with, like we can all kind of get on the same page with the idea that there's a very, very strong chance, if not a definite chance, that the sun is going to rise tomorrow morning. Deals with actual behavior, such as people talking with one another, characters acting certain ways in comic strips, video games, films, and television programs, or writers describing heroes in magazines and biographies. It has to do with what Berger calls manifest content. Content that is manifest, that we can argue all we want about whether an article in a newspaper or magazine is biased or unbiased or totally full of shit or not. We can't argue about its appearance, as such in a magazine. Defining content analysis, it's kind of a slippery beast. It's kind of a slippery beast, and Berger will point out why. Defining content analysis it turns out kind of complicated. he offers a number of different definitions by different research scholars. He does his homework. We know Arthur. Arthur is, he's busy. He does his homework, right? In the 2005 book, Analyzing Modern Messages Using Quantitative Content Analysis, Lacey, Riff, and Fico point out that quantitative content analysis is the systematic and replicable examination of symbols of communications. Emphasis on systematic, emphasis on replicable. What is done in academic media research is very, very like what is done in any kind of research methodology, whether it be, epidemiological research or, quantum research or astronomical research. It becomes a question of, within this realm of commonly shared, within this corpus of data of human civilization, it's like when I do an experiment, when I perform something, other researchers will ultimately ask, can I replicate the experiment? And will I get the same results if I replicate it? Hence the idea of replicability being one of the cornerstones of objective knowledge, It's like, which have been assigned. So, quantitative content analysis is a systematic and replicable examination of symbols of communication, which have been assigned numeric values. All right, there is a metric to all this. Content analysis involves being able to quantify stuff. What do we mean by quantify? That we come up with, some basis, whatever the units that we decide to select. Whether it be, minutes of network programming or, word count in an article, we need to have some basic consensual quantification of our data, whatever that data is, and sometimes how to come up with a metric of that, of a metric for that becomes a slippery beast unto itself and will be contested, So numeric values according to valid measurement rules and the analysis of relationships involving those values using statistical methods, like stressing the idea that, statistics, it's like if you decide to continue along this path, and I know I'm friends with people that have gone into communication programs that do a lot of quantitative analysis, and empirical studies. Cornell, it's like if you go to Cornell and study media research, they do a lot of empirical research. I know that Penn State, their doctoral programs and their grad programs do a lot of empirical research. That's not really what I do myself, but I have enough of an understanding of it and utilizing enough in my own life that it's like it's definitely a viable. If you decide to continue along your academic path, you might, and a lot of it is like very, very valuable research, especially now, especially in these times, with digitality and what kind, and we really, really have to start thinking about what this digital milieu is doing to our children. All right, doing to a generation of children we talk about all this in image theory, and it goes very, very deep. It's like, right now I'm reading another book by Bernard Stiegler, who is basically, trying to make a very, very sophisticated case about how human consciousness and our level of intelligence is being highly and deleteriously affected by the digital world, and how they want to sell us on the idea that, kids are, it's like everything's cool, kids are getting smarter, and but people need to be wary. It's like, as an anecdote, when I'm teaching a kindergarten class and it's time for everybody to get on their computers and get on the pedagogical software, whether it be ABC or whatever they're doing, whatever, the public school system buys these programs and buys in and licenses a lot of children's pedagogical digital programming, and what kind of effect it has on them, But when I'm walking down the line and looking over kids' shoulders and watching them do some fairly innocuous counting game or learning game, but along the sides, along the borders, there's ads. There's ads for insurance. There's ads for all kinds of silly things that, and the subliminality to it, and sitting there and being like, okay, I get it. Okay, it's like, it's all, and the fact that, and I gotta throw it out there, the fact that, people in the public, people in this vocation of pedagogy on the public education level wouldn't be contesting this more and more and just kind of taking it, is abominable. It's abominable, what we're doing. Coming back to so valid measurement rules and analysis of relationships involving those values using statistical methods to describe the communication. Draw inferences about its meaning or infer from the communication to its context, both of production and consumption. And remember, in the opening epigraph to the chapter, Berger uses a quote by a well-known German sociologist by the name of Leo Lowenthal, analyzing the appearance of before the war, doing a content analysis in which it seemed as if politicians and policymakers and science and thinkers seemed to have more of a prominence as active agents being referred to in journalism, and then after the war, it was more about all those people statistically kind of took a back seat to what was called agents of consumption, being like movie stars and sports figures and this whole cult of celebrity. And Lowenthal refers to the one demographic as being agents of production or the idols of production as opposed to the idols of consumption, and he'll keep referring to that in the chapter. So that's the first definition. He says there's different definitions of the subject we will encounter in this chapter. The authors of this book arrived at their definition after discussing a dozen definitions of content analysis made by other researchers. It's always like, we always have to, and we're going to talk about how we operationalize our definitions of things. If you get more into academia or any kind of scientific research or media research, you're going to have PhD advisors and dissertation advisors that are going to ask you to operationalize the terms you're using, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about operationalizing things and what it means. The term content analysis tells us broadly what the methodology does. It analyzes the content of something, whether it be a movie, whether it be a TV show, whether it be, National Geographic, whatever it is. But there's much more to content analysis than that. Let me offer, so here's Berger offering us another definition, this one from Wright's Mass Communication book. Content analysis is a research technique for the systematic classification and description of communication content according to certain usually predetermined categories. Hence the idea predetermined categories entails operationalized definitions. For instance, it's like, we're doing a study, the old, whipping boy in this thing, the one that people tend to go to is like violence. What constitutes violence as a representation, and the distinctions we make. There's different times. It's like, you need to define what you mean. What do you mean by violence? Because violence is very slippery. Or portrayals of female sexuality in content, or male sexuality. What do you define as being sexual? What do you define as, hence Berger will stress the idea of having a narrow, being narrow enough and yet being narrow and broad at the same time, in terms of, being able to define what you are analyzing, all right? And being able to have a working definition of what you mean when you use a certain kind of term, For instance, in my master's thesis at the New School, was I was making a film, but I also had a 50-page dissertation describing the film and what I was attempting to do in the film methodologically, and what I was trying to do in a documentary that I hadn't seen done. And I needed to define the idea of what a activist documentary was, and I would go into the literature and find and literally find a definition from other peer-reviewed stuff that seemed to fit the bill, and I used that, that we need to be able to, build knowledge, that we can all get on the same page about, hence the idea of operationalizing our terms, so that we all kind of know when I'm referring to violence, I am referring to this, and not as opposed to this, right? When I am referring to patriotism, it's or things that with a patriotic connotation, I am referring to this, and it becomes slippery and ideological too, Hence, there's always this kind of slippery slope in terms of empiricism when it comes to, content, because it always has to do with context, and it always has to do with these underlying assumptions that content doesn't necessarily correlate with, you can't analyze content and just naturally make certain assumptions about the behavior that content is going to elicit in the receiver or the subject, that's open to putting together correlate research studies that correlate certain things, all right? So content analysis does a certain kind of thing, but in order to kind of study its effects, we need to bring in other areas. We need to bring in other benchmarks and other phenomena and see if they correlate or not, and we'll talk more about it. So it may involve quantitative or qualitative analysis, and we've looked at both. We've looked at what quantitative and qualitative analysis is. Or technical objectivity requires that the categories of classification and analysis be clearly and operationally defined. It's we just can't be running, it's some of you, and I'm not going to name any names because it happens every semester, have a tendency to, be somewhat, nebulous about what you're attempting to say. And I need to, and in critiques of papers, I often find myself having to write in the borders in my chicken scratch, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? How would you define this? It's you're kind of, because, young undergrads have a tendency, this is not bashing you, have a tendency to, make certain assumptions when they're writing that aren't necessarily consensual. And or getting into logical circular arguments about stuff, or getting into the whole like correlation equals causation. Just because two things continue to appear together one time after another doesn't necessarily mean that they're connected, you know. And you know, one always has to kind of be robust about your study. So technical objectivity requires that the categories of classification and analysis be clearly and operationally defined so that the researchers can follow them reliably. For example, analysis of the social class memberships of television characters. All right, if we're going to do something about, for instance, the portrayal of, you know, of what has traditionally been called the professional classes, you know, and that's always a very, very what do you mean by the professional class? Like doctors, lawyers, bureaucrats, professors. Like somehow we get like lopped into that even though it's like in terms of like professional wages, it's like it's far off the mark. Like the professional class. What do you mean? Or, you know, depiction of characters representing law enforcement. You need to be able to define that. Or villains. What do you mean by a villain? Especially in the postmodern world, where often, you know, the villains, like for instance, the other night, it's like I was watching a fantastic film by Sidney Lumet from the early 70s called Dog Day Afternoon. If you've never seen it, I would strongly suggest you watch it because it's just awesome. And I watched it with the Sidney Lumet, one of our great American directors. And in the film, you know, it's like Al Pacino and John Cazale, the late great John Cazale, hold up a bank. They're bank robbers, right? And yet, you know, the way in which the narrative is told, we not only empathize with them, the so-called, you know, villains, but they're actually, one can make a case that they're the heroes of the film, you know, in terms of what Lumet is trying to say about society and whatnot. So, you know, we have to be very clear about how we are defining, you know, these overarching concepts of like what constitutes the hero, what constitutes the villain, what constitutes, you know, the sexualized character, you know, what can, you know, it's like these questions we have to ask. For example, analysis of the social class memberships of television characters requires clear specification of the criteria by which class is identified and classified, so that independent coders, and we'll talk a lot about how one comes up with a code, you know, that, you know, with media research, more often than not, coding is very, like anything else, you know, it's like coding is not much different, you know, I mean, it's a little more nebulous, for instance, than, you know, coding a strand of DNA, you know, but once again, I mean, the methodologies are kind of the same. You come up with you know, terms and devices that, you know, we can all kind of, terms and quantifiable units and definitions that we can all kind of get on board with as generating and having meaning for most reasonable people, you know. So the idea of coding is going to be important. We've already talked about coding interviews, you know, and Berger will be a stickler about the idea of coding, you know, and so that independent coders are likely to agree on how to classify a character. It is important to remember, however, that content analysis itself provides no direct data about the nature of the communicator, whatever it be, it doesn't, if I do a content analysis of how many times Trump appear, how many minutes CNN gives to Trump as opposed to MSNBC or, you know, Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, that doesn't say anything about the nature of the communicator, all right? It's just, we need to be objective, you know? It's like, you know, I can make all kinds of inferences about the leanings, the political leanings of the board of directors of a corporate-owned newspaper, through this stuff. I can make all kinds of inferences, but that involves further research. Doesn't tell us anything about the nature of the communicator, the nature of the audience, or its effects. All we're looking at is data. All we're looking at is data. The interpretation of that data is another animal. All right. Therefore, great caution must be exercised whenever this technique is used for any purpose other than the classification, description, and analysis of the manifest content of the communication. All right. We can make all kinds of inferences and speculations about what the effects are going to be on people, about what the overall goals are of the people that have put out the code, but that in itself is not, and there are other areas we know of research that deal with that deal with audience effects. That's not content analysis, all right? We need to we need to stay within this arena of what content analysis does and what it doesn't, in order for us to, correlate the effects, say, of violent programming on children's behavior. We would have to bring in a whole other set of data and be able to correlate it, to the data, and design a study that allowed for, certain things. I mean, I'll just give you an example. Let's say that you decided to do a study on a historical study on the appearances of gun-related violence on television that children are exposed to over, let's say, a 10 or 20 year period. The periodicity of gun violence, and later take that content analysis and try to do some kind of correlative research as to how it translates into, for instance, childhood juvenile delinquency, or, and then you would have to get an entirely different data set in order to be able to build some kind of hypothesis that, it's like we see this rise in gun violence on television. We're also seeing this, you might have to scour these databases of juvenile detention and the statistics on, admissions due to gun-related violence of minors, and all of that, and even with all of that, it's like one can start to poke holes in your research depending on how thorough you were with your demographic. For instance, let's say there's a rise in television gun violence, and there's a rise in the frequency of minors being charged with gun-related charges, and it's and I have that statistic, that statistic, it's correlation doesn't necessarily translate to causation, because let's say there's outstanding factors. For instance, we could always say come to find out that 90% of those juveniles that were admitted in juvenile detention centers or jail for gun-related crimes. Somebody else might do a study and say, did you know that 90% of those that were admitted had live-in fathers that had been convicted of a violent felony or had a gun or whatever it is. So we always have to, research is always very deep and very heavy, and other things can always account for causation, that we have to take into account. And that's why it's difficult, and that's why it's usually best to leave it to experts to spend their entire lives, doing this kind of stuff, as opposed to, your Uncle Joe that, wants to make these general inane comments about all this younger generation. It's just, it's leave it to, it's academics get so bashed in this society, and sometimes rightly so, all right, but they also do good stuff too. Let's not paint it all with the same brush about what academics do. It's like, and I'm getting, and this is just, okay, you get one more instance of Bongiorno going off in a lecture. This is like a gift to you, all right? You get a little of this in the middle of this. It's like, here's the way I feel about getting into political / philosophical / sociological / economic discussions with people on the street, all right? I just don't do it anymore. I don't do it anymore, even like with like family members. They want to tell me this, that, and the other thing about what they gleaned about a circumstance from just listening to talk radio all day long, or just, it's like when on the other side of it, it's like, I'm a paid academic, I do all this kind of research, and I get paid. People pay me to hazard an educated opinion about stuff and tell you stuff. It's like, I'm starting to get to a point where I'm just like, you know what? It's like, it's like you're not paying me to like give you my opinion about stuff. It's like later. It's like you want me to engage in all kinds. It's like, and usually it's just people that there's this whole like thing about like people just like, well, you're just like an academic. What the hell do you know? Somebody that spent your entire life like reading and watching stuff and putting things together. It's like, what do you know? What do you know? Well, I know a few things, my friends. I know a few things. So anyway, back to this. Number of concepts mentioned in this. So great caution must be exercised whenever this technique is used for any purpose other than the classification, description, and analysis of the manifest content of the communication. A number of concepts, Berger goes on, a number of concepts mentioned in this passage require definition and clarification. Operational definition, coding, what is manifest content, which I explain in the following pages. Let me offer a third definition. He's very thorough. Let me offer a third definition that helps clarify what content analysis involves. This comes from Donald Treadwell's Introducing Communication Research Paths of Inquiry. Treadwell started by quoting a famous definition by Bernard Berelson, an important media researcher in the 50s. Quoting Berelson says, in the context of communication research, content analysis is a quantitative, systematic, and objective technique for describing the manifest content of communication. Then Treadwell offers the following amplifications. All right, and we already know what amplifications are, right? Following amplifications. 1, quantitative means that we count occurrences of whatever we're interested in. All right, whatever, not what I'm interested. Like I might be interested in, like what we're interested in the context of our research. That this is what I'm interested in getting through the research, right? And it's about the periodicity of something, how often it appears, and in what form. Systematic means that we count all relative aspects of the sample. We cannot arbitrarily pick what aspects get analyzed, right? If we come up with a definition of whatever it is we're looking for, whether it be, violence, or whether it be, portrayals of women, whatever it is, whatever we're looking to cope, or appearances of certain types of classes and the ways they're treated, and always, we can't just like, we need to be broad. We need to be broad, and, it's like, and we need to be able to define, how broad our research is. I might want to just limit, do I limit, and then questions arise for your research. Do you want to just concentrate on the national news, or local news? Do you want to concentrate on just news, or do you want to concentrate on narrative television? Do you want to concentrate on, violence in in just television media or also like games and games and books. You know, it's like these are decisions that you need to make depending on the design of your study. Objective means that we seek units for analysis and categorize them using clearly defined criteria. We need to like have a metric. How many minutes of television? Does this include commercials? Does it not? You know, does it include paid programming? Does it not? You know, are we making distinctions between what the sponsors' messages are, or what the broadcast network's message are? You know, and once again, like, you know, where's the money going? Because we're seeing more and more that ethical and responsible journalism is leaning a lot more, for instance, like on public news and public television and NPR, they are making a point, and this is a fairly new phenomena of making a point of the fact that if I run a story on a certain company or concern or corporation, they often put in an aside, you know, to kind of define the fact that, oh, by the way, they also underwrite this program. You know, that they're going as far as, is that ethical? Is that an ethical move? Yeah, by all means. You know, it's an ethical move to run a story on somebody who's paying your bill, or who's part of paying your payroll. You know, hence, you know, being able to, you know, kind of, you know, at least put on this veneer of being unbiased. Manifest means that we count what is tangible and observable, not what's inferred, not what, it's like just what's there. It's like I use the whole like just the facts, ma'am, from Dragnet. I just want the facts. I just need what's there. You know, I can make all kinds of inference. You know, it's like, for instance, you know, we might want to talk about subliminal advertising and all those other qualitative psychoanalytical approaches, but in content analysis, we're just sticking to the stuff. Whatever's there, that's the stuff. For example, we cannot count patriotism and consume. We can't count. It's like, I want to find instances of patriotism in something. You can't really do that because patriotism is so abstract an idea. Remember semiotics, right? You know, something that stands in for something else. It's such an abstract or latent notion. What we can count is the frequency, for instance, of the use of the word patriotism, or how often that word occurs. The frequency, maybe how often the flag occurs. You know, it's like, you know, it just goes without saying, like, you know, for instance, a lot of sales and stuff like that, especially in the summer. It's like a lot of companies that are private companies will do their shit in red, white, and blue with eagles and whatever to like sell. You know, it's like whatever that is. That has really nothing to do with like selling fucking wall-to-wall carpet. You know, but they want to put on this veneer of being patriotic, you know, or whatever they're selling. But we can count frequencies of things like the appearance of content. You know, how often does the national flag appear, or perhaps the number of minutes of music defined as patriotic. You know, let's say like, you know, somebody's, you know, doing a commercial about their freaking used car lot and this big July 4th sale they're having, or Memorial Day sale, and in the background there's like either John Philip Sousa or whatever, you know, like dun, 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 dun. It's like, you know, it's like, all right, it's like we can define, you know, what patriotic, you know, it's usually, you know, we know what that is. We can apply content analysis to all forms of communication, from the personal to the mass mediated. All right. So we could use, all right. So, you know, it's not just about mass media. We could like look at like text messages, you know, which is often done. you know, and there's all these algorithms that, you know, look at your own messages for, you know, any appearance of, you know, not being patriotic, or, you know, say, you know, it's like, we know they do this. We already know you do this, you know, so it's like, we can apply, so it doesn't just have to be mass communication, but here we're talking about mass communication. Many scholars would add that content analysis cannot tell us the effects on audiences of the material being studied. Can't necessarily infer effects from the content. The content, we're just looking at, once again, just the facts, man. Content analysis tells us what is in the material being studied, not how it affects people exposed to the material. On the other hand, if you find an example that children's television, for instance, that children's television shows have a great deal of violence in them, whether it is comic or not, you cannot help but wonder what the impact of that violence is having upon the kids. Fortunately, other research methods have explored this question in great detail. Other forms of research, not the content analysis part. Will other researchers take content analysis in order to build another study about the effects? Of course, you know, but that's not what we're doing here. Chaim Eyal, an Israeli media scholar who taught in Berger's department for many years, offers a critique of content analysis. And he puts in parentheses here, you know, Berger always like wanting to do a citation in a personal communication, right? If content analysis is the study of manifest content, then how could the analyst possibly draw conclusions about the reader, actual or attended? You can't do that. It's like stepping out. It's just being presumptive, right? To do so requires making assumptions and jumping to conclusions that cannot possibly be supported by the text. This would clearly render the analysis non-objective, another violation of the method, all right? So that we need to remain in content analysis, regardless of what we later do with that analysis, we need to remain objective in defining our terms, right? Eyal focuses our attention on a dilemma people making content analysis face. They find it difficult to refrain from making inferences. You know, we know what an inference is. We can't infer things, all right, about the audience of text and what impact these texts are having upon people exposed to these texts. This dilemma is something we must keep in mind when we are making content analysis. You know, it's like I could make all kinds of anecdotal. It's like, you know, when I was a kid, it's like we were watching all these cartoons and there was always and they were always like just hyperkinetic. You know, it's like, and there would be things going on, and it's like, you know, it's like, you know, whether it be Underdog or Bugs Bunny or Wile E. Coyote, they're always kind of moving around a lot. You know, there was a lot of action, there was a lot of slapstick, there was a lot of like perceived comic violence, you know. So and you know, the same with kids today. It's like I watch like children's programming and I just see all these one thing I noticed about like children's commercials is that when it has to do with like a sugary cereal or a toy or something like that, everybody's eyes kind of pop out, like all the characters in it, you know, and it's like, you know, it's like, but for instance, let's say you're going to do some kind of analysis on the rise in autism or ADHD or Asperger's syndrome or any kind of childhood psychological malady, by doing some kind of historical, longitudinal research on the exposure, you know. There's a lot of factors involved in that, you know, because other things might explain it than just, you know, the fact that everybody's hyper in cartoons. Because it's like I'm saying, everybody was like, you know, the cartoons we watched, people were hyper, and it becomes very, very intricate, you know. It's like, I think it's a matter of the degree. You know, and I think there's something to be said about, I think that ultimately someone will do a study of like cell animation versus like digital, like 3D animation, and ultimately find that there's some kind of physiognomical effect between those two kind of media. You never know. You never know what's going to happen, all right? Like many other research methodologies discussed in this book, most of us do a personalized form of content. We do it all the time. You know, we're watching stuff, you know, and we're always doing content analysis on our own, you know. Just like we're always kind of doing media research on our own, you know, and it's not just media studies students either. You know, it's like Joe Schmo is doing content analysis of a sort, one might say. You know, Joe Sixpack is doing his own thing with it, you know, whether it be buying into total bullshit or not. You know, it depends on your tools. You know, he's got tools too. You know, they might be like stone knives and bear skins as opposed to sophisticated, you know, intellectual methods, but he does his thing too. We are always searching for meaning and trying to figure out why people do things and what their actions signify. But content analysis is different from our attempts to make sense of communication. All right? That has to do with what? Semiotic analysis, rhetorical analysis, psychoanalytic criticism, ideological criticism. That's not what content analysis does, I repeat. You know? So, where are we? But content analysis is different from our attempts at making sense of communication in that it is more systematic and it's more objective and it is quantitative. It measures and counts things of interest to us. And here's just some little memes and little things I brought up about these little cartoons about children's television violence that I thought some of them were kind of cute. Yeah. Because I realized like most of this PowerPoint had to do with like tax and like geez next like this is Bongiorno talking now, and this is what I'm going to say about it. All right, this is a quote from me. All right, and it has to do with this. It has to do with what I find after doing this for a while and being in this game for a while. Really effective content analysis usually involves the synthesis and integration of other reliable research studies to substantiate one's claims, you know, assertions, and the interpretation of one's data, all right? Ultimately, is that content analysis as such? No, but the ways in which we use content. Knowledge is referential and contextual. It needs to keep its scope well defined and allow for other factors. All right, that's just me talking. I've already given you examples of that. Always got to allow for other factors in the research, you know, in order for the research to be meaningful, right? Why do we do it? Why do we do it? Why do we make content analysis? First, we use content analysis as a research method for a number of reasons. We want to get information about a topic, and we believe that content analysis, rather than other research methods, will help us get the information we're seeking. Thus, we might want to know how much violence there is on American television and whether there's more violence now than there was earlier, in earlier years. Has it increased? Hence, you know, Berger stressing the idea of sometimes doing a historical analysis. You know, it's not enough just to do, like, you know, paper that appeared, you know, it's like sometimes that is the method that you got to use, right? Thus, we might want to know how much violence there is on American television, whether there's more violence now than there was in earlier years. Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? You know, we can't infer stuff until we do the thing. You know, it's like we can think all kinds of anecdotal shit about like what may or may not be happening. But unless we do the research, you know, we're not going to know. You know, for instance, it's like, say, I want to do some kind of longitudinal study between portrayals of due to the uptick in feminist discourse, the amount of sexualized characters on shows. It's like I might for every logical reason, think that, you know, that had changed. But until I go to the data and find out, I might find out nothing's changed, and that, you know, and that those sociological and political phenomena, that it's still as bad as ever, you know, and with as much frequency. But I'm not going to know anything until I do an analysis of the content, you know, over time. You know, content analysis is the methodology that helps us obtain the answers to these questions. We may also be interested in whether the amounts of violence on American television differs from British or French. You know, it's like we you know, it's like, you know, if we just did an analysis of what went on in this country, especially nowadays, it's like, you know, the idea of doing just a study of like the satanic circus that is American culture, all right, as opposed to, you know, other societies, you know, it's like, it's not really saying much about humanity as such, you know, until we, you know, kind of widen our net, you know, and use content analysis, and we got to use content analysis to find out. We need it's like, you know, things might mean something, you know, in this circus of terror that don't appear in, you know, in Madrid or in, you know, Paris or in, you know, Istanbul. We don't know, you know. Methodological, it's early, folks. Methodological aspects of content analysis. Factual information, what we term factoids by itself, doesn't tell us much. Factoids. If one were to say, quote, in 2015 there were approximately 30 acts of violence per hour on American television, we wouldn't know very much, because we wouldn't know what this factoid means. What does it mean, right? What we need is perspective, something with which to compare the 2015 factoid. Here are some ways to make that comparison. Determine your research question, all right? You need to determine what the question is that you're posing. Before you begin, you have to decide what you're going to measure and what you hope to find out, all right? What you hope to find out, not what's there, what you think is going to be there, but what you hope to gather, you know, to find out, all right? Based on no preconception about how it's going to go, you know? That's the thing, and that's what I was talking about, this race to, you know, and in other forms of research, you know, you got to be it's like, you know, there are all these like regulatory mechanisms put in place in reasonable society about what we put in our bodies, what we ingest, what we breathe, what we drink, and what we inject into our system in order to offset a virus or a condition, and that there needs to be a proper amount of research and study on things like, for instance, let's say a COVID-19 vaccine that takes time, double-blind studies, controlled studies, placebos, you know, placebo studies to make sure that A, it's actually going to be efficacious, and B, it's not going to do more harm than good due to side effects. And C, is it going to work for all people under all conditions? You know, these are all things that need to be parsed. And all that kind of research takes time, you know? So that when we hear this fucking bullshit that comes out of Trump about warp speed programs, we need to be very, very, very suspect, all right, about this race to a vaccine. All right, because that's not how that's especially, it's like, it's one thing to do research on something you're reading or some game you're reading. It's another thing to go after a deadly disease, all right, that's like taking out more people every day than the World Trade Center. You need to be serious about it. You need to be serious about it. And you need to do the proper amount of research to make sure that it's safe, that you're not causing more harm than good. You know, you want to race to stuff for political expediency, that's your game, brother. That's not the game of my loved ones, and that's not the game of this country. All right? We want something that's efficacious. Yeah, we want something, but we got to understand the history of this, my friends. The fastest vaccine historically that has ever come out in American history was the mumps vaccine. And it took 4 years, all right? 4 years, all right? So let's knock it up on our high horse about warp speed. Warp speed is good on Star Trek, my friend, dear Donald. It might be really good on Star Trek and Star Wars. Maybe that's where you belong, you know, on the Enterprise, as opposed to the Oval Office. All right, it's stop talking shit. Okay, so you're getting a good send off here with my stuff. Determine your research question. Before you begin, you have to decide what you're going to measure and what you hope to find out. Conduct a live research on the subject that you propose. That's where all this comes in. Sometimes we do a literature review. Sometimes we need to find out if the study that we are doing or we want to do hasn't already been done. You know, it's or hasn't, or we need to rethink what our game is. All right. Also, make sure that your research topic fits your time constraints. All right. Let's say you're taking hence, you know, we had problems thinking about coming up with research projects that only take a semester, and I had talked to Margaret Bates about, you know, coming up with stuff. And yet at the same time, it's I know that, you know, after further discussions with Ed Evans, who also teaches the class, he found ways of doing quantitative research projects with the class or polls that I may ultimately end up adopting in other iterations of this class. So they're doable. It's just a question of, you know, whether they can be done in the time that we have or not. In any given semester. It's sometimes, for instance, you know, I was talking about, you know, that book Toxic Town that I appear in. You know, that, you know, it's that project, that research, and it was ultimately a research project that Peter Little did in that book, and it took years. I'm sure, you know, doctoral dissertations sometimes can take a decade, you know, or films or things like that. All right, so got to find out how much time you have. You also make sure that your research topic fits your time constraints. Generally speaking, the narrower the focus, the better, especially for student projects. That's why I'm always kind of reining people in. And you know, you want to do something about life, the universe, and everything. That takes a lifetime. We've got 15 weeks to do something. Use a historical approach when making a content analysis. Only if we use a historical approach and can say, and I'm making all these figures up he's making figures up for illustrative purposes. In 1985, there was approximately 10 acts of violence. I'm going to have to round this up in a minute. In 1985, there was approximately 10 acts of violence per hour on television. In 2015, we say approximately 30 acts of violence per hour on television. Do we have information of value? Now we know that in 2015 there was 3 times as much violence per hour on American television than there was 30 years ago. The historical approach has given us a perspective. Now we understand how things have occurred over time. Also, and that was true of Lowenthal's 1944 study cited at the beginning of the chapter about his comparing biographies, you know, magazines published between this certain period. Number 3, use a comparative approach when making content analysis. If we also do a comparative study of television violence and discover that in Sweden, for example, there were 3 acts of violence per hour on television in 2008, we have information that helps us gain additional perspective on violence on American television, assuming that the content analysis has been done correctly. We can say that American television contains 10 times more violence than Swedish television. My point, Berger's point then, is that content analyses are most valuable when they have a historical or a comparative component to them, or both. Having numbers is important. If a researcher says there's a lot of violence on American television, we would want to know what the researcher means by a lot. What is a lot? To a professor of communications may be a little. To a manager of a television station. Once again, it's kind of like there's a question of empirical research done by experts trained in this stuff, and then there's your Aunt Harriet going off about how wild kids are nowadays. You know, it's like, prove it. Prove that they're wilder. You know, prove that they're this. Prove that they're that. You know, don't live in this realm of like anecdotal assumptions. Don't base your life on like what, you know, some moron says. You know, it's like, go after what's real. Go after what's real. You know, and I think that is, you know, as fine of a concluding note as I can make here. It's been an interesting semester. I'm looking forward to seeing your papers and projects. You know, I know we're all under, you know, conditions of duress. You know, it's like I'm going to be compassionate in the whole grading process. A lot of people, I think, got nervous about, you know, when I was talking about like attendance policy and like commenting on the blogs and stuff like that. But that, you know, sometimes we gotta bluff to get you to do things. You know, it's like, because you and I both know that a lot of your profs, you know, just, you know, we know how some people operate, man. It's like you miss 5 classes, you're done. You know, it's like, and you and I both know it. You know, whereas with me, under pandemic conditions, if I might give you 6 or 7, you know, and then you're done. So, it's been real. Listen, take care of yourselves. You know, try to make the most out of your summers. If you need to contact me for any reason, you have my number, you have my email. You know, if you need letters of reference, if you need advice about something, you know, I'm there for you. My thoughts and prayers are there for you. My hopes for a good overall outcome to these tragic situations, and I wish you well. You know, and I leave you on an optimistic note. You know, it's like you're the answer. You are the answer. So, take care.